Welcome to Speak Out. I'm Sandy Galef, a member of the New York State Assembly, and I represent parts of northern Westchester and parts of Putnam County. And today we have a wonderful, wonderful topic. And it's called Milestones in Political History. HERstory. I got it wrong. But with me is Dana White, the Ossining Village historian. Thank you so much, Dana. So what is the topic?
Women's suffrage, milestones in political history for HERstory. For female politicians. Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. And it's such a really wonderful period of time that we're talking about. But let's get to know a little bit about you. You are the Ossining Village historian, and you've been doing that for a number of years now.
4 years now.
4 years. Mm-hmm. How did you decide to venture into this activity?
Well, I had a career. I lived in the city, or I worked in the city, lived in Ossining as a magazine editor, and I'm still a journalist, and I'm still a freelance writer. And I was just interested in local history, and I was very involved with the Ossining Historical Society. And we actually did a project, a house tour on my street of historic homes, and I got really into that. And I, just was in love with all of the history that Ossining has. From the prison, of course, which has its own fascinating 200-year history, the Leatherman, the fabulous old cemeteries that we have, the Ossining waterfront. And so when Mayor Garrity took office in 2015, she asked if I would be the village historian. Every municipality is supposed to have one. So there's also a town historian as well.
Right.
That's Scott Craven. That's a different.
Right.
But I'm the village.
The village. I wonder if all communities do. They're supposed to.
They're supposed
just
to.
Yeah. Keep the history alive.
Yep.
And not every community has a historical society building, though.
No.
So. Do you end up with a lot of files in your home?
I do have a lot of files. My office is an absolute mess. And the Historical Society is an amazing resource for me. I couldn't do what I do without their files. They're still old school file cabinets full of paper, but they also have amazing digital resources in terms of photographs and the Slater collection. And my training as a magazine editor was to marry words and images. And so that's what I try and do as the historian, is I do a lot of research on images, and then I use them to help tell the story of a street or an area or a person, or I did a 30-minute video on the history of Ossining that came up all the way to the present. And I think part of it was that, I didn't grow up in Ossining. I wasn't born there. I moved there in 1991, so that's actually a long time ago. I had kids and I had a job, and then I just kind of said, wow, there was all this amazing, interesting history in my own backyard, almost literally. Right. And I just am always myself learning something new.
Right.
And I try and bring to it a storyteller's kind of approach, because that's when I write articles or I'm working on a novel, that's how you tell the story, and it feels you get more involved that way than if it's just dry facts.
Well, let's look at that political HERstory. We are celebrating a really wonderful period of time in the year 2019 of women having the right to vote for 100 years. But there was a lot of work that went into that.
There was. It's kind of, that we've had the right to vote for, to me, it's like only 100 years, Right. But the country isn't that old, and it took a while to convince some people that we deserved it. But it really began, New York State, it began in New York State, the fight for the vote for women, women's suffrage. Began in upstate New York in 1848 with a women's convention in Seneca Falls, and women's rights. Even in the in the early 19th century, there were a few women who were saying, we demand equal rights under the law, and the Constitution didn't really give women those rights. They didn't give a lot of people rights. So the Seneca Falls Convention was really the first place where the women's vote became something that was on the list of demands.
I was up there. I had the wonderful opportunity to go up there this summer. I've always wanted to do that. I went up to Seneca Falls, and they had this whole wall of the principles. Well, they put it together as a museum, but the principles that they had, and women at that period of time didn't have, you know, if they made money, if they had a job, their money went to their husband. If their husband died, they still didn't have the ability to keep the property.
Right.
I mean, there were so many things that, besides voting, not voting, so many other things
No,
that
you
they
didn't
were
have the
denied.
right, you know, that's why the rights for women were very much tied up with the rights for other people. Susan B. Anthony, who is considered the godmother of really the 19th Amendment, you know, she was a Quaker from upstate New York, and she was an abolitionist, and also a temperance advocate, which is a whole thing, but there was a big problem with alcoholism. So there was a lot of women who would join this movement against drinking alcohol. But then the right to vote became part of this. And so Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were probably the two figures early on who were most responsible for getting out this idea that women deserved to be equal to men in every way, because property was very much the basis of power. What you owned, being a landowner, was the basis of your power. So if you couldn't own land, you know, and you couldn't vote, who was represented, and so that you weren't voting for the people who were supposedly representing your needs. And so it was really, there wasn't the representation that women felt they deserved.
Susan B. Anthony, after going to her house when I was up there, apparently her bags were packed all the time, and she must have been on a train.
She traveled constantly. She and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were a team. And Stanton was married and had quite a few children, but she was considered the brains, and she was a great writer. So she would kind of write a lot of the speeches, and then Susan B. Anthony, because she was a Quaker, she wasn't married, she didn't have a family, so she was always out spreading the gospel.
Right.
Okay, and she was a very forceful, very, very powerful speaker. So they were kind of. I think one of them said that Elizabeth Cady Stanton would write the thunderbolts and Susan B. Anthony would deliver them. And they were a very effective pair.
Right, right. So they were doing all this, but it still took more time. It just seemed like, I don't know, some of the history that I think you've seen is about what happened I always thought New York, as you said, New York was a leader, but there were all these other states early on that were
ahead of us.
Ahead of us, yes,
We were actually, New York was one of the last to give women the right to vote before the 19th Amendment was enacted. There were still 21 states or so that gave women no rights. It depended, but the Western territories, right after the Civil War, were the first to give women the right to vote in elections. Wyoming in 1869, when it was still a territory. Washington State, Montana, Utah, Alaska, when they were all still territories. And why is, there's several theories. One is that, you know, life as a pioneer, especially if you're a woman, was extremely difficult, dangerous. And they say the men appreciated the women more out west than they did in the Northeast. But it may have been, too, that there were so few people that they needed every voting body they could get. And so also the first woman elected to federal office in 1916 was from Montana. And actually the first female governor was Wyoming. And so Colorado was the first state. Wyoming and Colorado were the first two states to give women the right to vote in the 1890 and 1893. And right after that, 3 women in Colorado were elected to the Colorado State Legislature.
Right. Were there women that ran and got elected that couldn't serve in any of these, or were they?
Well, the weird thing is that even though women couldn't vote in elections, they could run for elected office.
So they could be in the elected office, but they couldn't go out and vote in another election.
No. So that's why there were women who ran for president in the 19th century. In 1872, Victoria Woodhull ran for president. She was kind of an eccentric woman who lived in New York and very intelligent and very very charismatic, and they never counted her votes because they thought it was kind of a joke. But in 1872, it's the same year Susan B. Anthony was arrested for voting in that very election. So you had in 1872, those two sides of it. The Susan B. Anthony voted for Ulysses S. Grant, not Victoria Woodhull apparently, but
Did they count her vote? No.
No, she was arrested and put on trial for voting.
Oh, okay.
For daring to vote for president, and they fined her $100 and she refused to pay. So.
Right, and that was that. And then she continued her efforts ever after.
After the Civil,
Right.
after the Civil War and abolition was supposedly solved or achieved, then women's rights became much more of a focus. But there was a lot of discord in the movement, and maybe they didn't get as much accomplished because there were a lot of different factions that felt, that women should have been written into the Constitution along with the 14th Amendment, the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony was very disappointed that they weren't given the right to vote at the same time that slavery was abolished. But they fought the good fight, and it wasn't really until after 1900 that the movement really picked up speed and united. And in fact, the woman who really united the suffrage movement lived in Ossining. That was Carrie Chapman Catt, I believe. And she lived on North State Road on an estate starting in 1919. But she was really, she was from Iowa, and she lived in New York for a long time. And she succeeded Susan B. Anthony as president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And she came up with the plan for getting the resolution for women's suffrage to be passed in the states. And that once they got enough states,
so each state, because
so they went state by state
Right.
instead of just focusing purely on the big federal picture, and that actually worked.
Well, you know what's interesting? I mean, we do that today in Albany. We have to think about other strategies. So in New York State, the vote was in 1917.
Yes, that's
was
when
the
women were given the
right to vote in New York. So what kind of campaigns were going on during this period of time? I think.
Well, I think after 1900, and there about several million women joined the movement. It was a genuine movement, and they marched. They marched down Fifth Avenue. I think we have a picture of that. They marched on Washington. Hundreds of thousands of women. I marched on Washington, but it was more recently. They had hunger strikes, civil disobedience. They stood outside with signs protesting President Wilson. And it was the same sorts of activist things we see today, only now we have social media to help us
Were they
along.
arrested?
They
were there
were
a good
arrested.
number
They
arrested?
were put in jail. In England, it was worse. It was more violent, but they didn't give up, and they had a unified voice that they could speak with. And it just got to the point where enough states had enacted voting rights for women that the ones that were still holding back were mostly in the South and a few up in the Northeast. But, it just became a matter of they just couldn't ignore them anymore. you know?
Right. But what's so fascinating is, so the women do not have the right to vote to give them the right to vote.
No, they could not vote.
They couldn't vote to give themselves a right to vote. Right. It had to be men.
Yes.
They had
to get male allies.
They had to get male allies and get enough of them to change the whole scenario.
Well, I have a feeling those male allies had wives who had very strong opinions about this as well. So we can't forget that. But
there probably had to be a lot of convincing back in those
there were a
periods
lot of women
time.
who didn't want the right to vote too.
Right.
I mean, it was
Yes,
considered. They would do these scare campaigns where if you gave a woman the right to vote, next thing you know, she would be abandoning her babies and, marching off with signs, and you'd never see her again. But of course, that woman can actually have a job and children and vote all at the same time.
Right.
It's really amazing.
Well, it's just so we were, even though we were kind of a late state, starting out early, but then being late. we did have a lot of people just actually in this area, as you said, that were very involved in this. Is that because it was close to New York City, maybe? Do you think that that had anything to do with it?
Well, I think New York's history as a breeding ground for the movement has generated, a generation, especially lately, of really great women politicians. The first women elected to the state legislature was 1919, and they were from Long Island. The first woman from Westchester elected to the state senate was the 1930s. There were two real trailblazers from New York City, and that would be Shirley Chisholm, who in 1968 became the first black woman to be elected to Congress, and she ran for president in 1972 and got about 400,000 votes. And then Geraldine Ferraro.
1972, she ran for president. That was quite early. Well, there was a lot going on then. There was a lot going on with women's rights.
Her tagline was "Unbought and Unbossed." That was her. Well, there was. I mean, the women's rights movement had really, sprung up and was very strong. And Bella Abzug, in 1970, she had the famous line, "This woman does belong in the House of Representatives." So kind of women's lib, kind of met up with women's rights and with political office. And Geraldine Ferraro, of course, was the first woman to run on a major party presidential ticket. Walter Mondale selected her in 1984 to be his vice president.
That was a very exciting period of time just to have a first, it didn't matter about the politics, just the first woman, to be running for vice president. And she didn't have a lot of people in that role.
The debate with George W. Bush, she debated George W. Bush, who was Reagan's vice president, and George H.W. Bush,
right.
I'm sorry, Pappy. And she had a very famous debate with him, televised debate. In fact, the first time my husband met my mother, she was watching that debate in 1984. I remember it quite well. But she accused him of being patronizing, and he was. But she acquitted herself very well. Unfortunately, they didn't win. But she was really a trailblazer, and also the first Italian-American, I believe, a woman to have achieved that high of a level in politics. So that was pretty exciting. But now we have some great women who just got reelected. And it all kind of started, or another big push was 1991. And that is the scene, the picture where the women are running up the steps of the Capitol building. And in 1991, the Clarence Thomas hearings were going on. These confirmation hearings for the Supreme Court. And of course, we all know that Anita Hill accused him of sexual harassment.
But we also know that the Judiciary Committee, I think, was sitting there, and they were all men.
And they were all men, and they were, so it just felt like, what do we have to do to be heard? And when they found out that the Judiciary Committee was not going to allow Anita Hill to testify and tell her side of the story, seven congresswomen stormed the Senate. They ran up the steps, and one of them was Nita Lowey, our very own Nita Lowey, in 1991. She had only been in office for 2 years, and Pat Schroeder was another, and I believe Dianne Feinstein was another, and they demanded that that she be allowed to testify and that she be given a fair hearing, and she did testify. Now I don't know if she got a fair hearing or not, and he was confirmed, but that just sparked a lot of women got angry, and they started. If that sounds familiar, recent history.
It actually is. So that was 1991. I remember running in 1992 for the Assembly, and it was the Year of the Woman. And what happened in Westchester County, we had 4 women that got elected to the Assembly out of the 7 for our county, which was like totally unusual. Before that, I think there'd been one, Cecile Singer from Yonkers. So it was just, and we actually had, the newspapers were following us around Albany because we were kind of like a unique thing that the majority of New York State Assembly people from Westchester were women. And
it was also Carol Moseley Braun was elected that year, the first African-American woman senator. So it was a big deal, and that kind of began, I think, there's increasing numbers of women running for office, and we really saw that in the midterms. There was a record
Right.
number of women elected to the House, and it helped get the majority back. So.
Right. No, but we've had periods of time. So it was 1992, the Year of the Woman, and then 2018 was kind of the Year of the Woman. And when you think about it,
Once again,
both
based on Supreme Court hearings.
Supreme Court hearings.
Yes.
So that
Yes.
that is kind of fascinating.
Well,
Well, not
don't-
all of that.
don't-
Not all of that.
Don't
but-
get us mad. I think that's because when women get mad, they don't lash out, they act. And I think that we saw, just some really tremendous candidates, and we saw a lot of barriers broken. I mean, there were candidates who did commercials breastfeeding their babies. I mean, these kind of, which is like, some people
Right.
just don't want to, I mean, this kind of, embrace of their womanhood.
Right.
And,
there was actually somebody who ran for Congress that got the election law to change that they could use their campaign funds for childcare as they ran. And I don't remember who that was. It might have been somebody on Long Island. But that was kind of a unique thing because what you raise in a campaign has limitations on how you can spend it. So that was kind of like spending it on a personal thing, but it was also to allow somebody to be
so
able
she
to
could
run for office so
Yeah.
that she could run. So I thought that was somewhat unique.
Well, that's what happens when you get women in office, is that you start getting laws and policy that are women friendly. I mean, that's not always the case.
Right.
But when those 3 women in Colorado were elected in 1893, they really focused on legislation that would help other women, including girls and women with children and families. And so, I mean, that's the ultimate level of representation, isn't it? Is to have a woman like you in office, knowing exactly what you need.
Right. Well, it has been true, even throughout my years in office, that the women have really taken on the domestic violence issues, obviously the sexual harassment issues that we're still dealing with today. The women have promoted more of those, and childcare, frankly, because women are still there and responsible for childcare, so it's still a part of it. But and so here in New York, we talked about Shirley Chisholm from New York, Geraldine Ferrara.
Well, more recently, Andrea Stewart Cousins was, of course, is now going to be hopefully the majority leader in the state Senate. She's from Yonkers. I mean, there are several women from the Hudson Valley, and Shirley Mayer is also from Yonkers, and she just won. And then it's interesting on the at the national level. Of course, Kirsten Gillibrand just, of course, won her Senate seat again, and she's kind of, people are asking her about running for president, and we'll see what happens. Alexandria, the young woman from I knew I wasn't
Yorktown Heights.
Yorktown
Yes.
Heights. She's the youngest woman elected to the House of Representatives, Ocasio-Cortez, and she's just setting the place on fire. And then there was also, who am I missing?
Well, a while ago, not too long ago, 2 years.
Nita Lowey, of course, just got
Nita
elected
Lowey,
to
right.
her 16th
And
term.
she may be the head of the Budget and Appropriations Committee.
And she was one of those 7 women in 1991,
Right.
insisting on being heard.
Right. And then, of course, 2 years ago, we had Hillary Clinton from Westchester run for president.
And she got more than 65 million votes.
Right.
Which to me is actually, I think, kind of the greatest milestone. That many votes is a lot.
Right. It'll be very interesting to see when we will have a woman president
Yes,
at some
we will.
point. The question is going to be when
And who.
And who. And we don't know that answer at this point, but it will be something to look forward to. Can you imagine that the women way back then, 100 years ago or beyond, ever thought that a woman would run for president? I can't imagine that was but maybe it was. Maybe
Well,
Susan
I think
B.
it was. I
Anthony
think that
thought
was the
about it.
ultimate goal. I mean, you saw women kind of trying to do it. In the 1880s, a New York woman, Belva Lockwood, ran twice and actually that was the first time a woman's votes for president were counted. I'm not sure they expected a woman to necessarily win. You know, I'm not sure that they could anticipate what the two-party system would look like in this country necessarily. But I think in their wildest fantasies that there was definitely a woman sitting in the Oval Office, not as the First Lady, but as Madam President. And so you kind of feel like it's taken, certainly, you know, a long time, but change takes time. And I think that they'd be very happy to see what was happening in some respects, and maybe not happy in others.
Right. I think I haven't really counted the numbers in the New York State Legislature, but I think in the Assembly we're 40. I think there are 42 out of 150 that are women. So you know we're pretty close to a third. Coming up from like 25%.
That's about what's happened at the national level with all the women who won House seats.
Right.
It was 20% before. It's got to be 25 or more now.
Right. So it has really added up, and we'll see, you know, what the issues are as they go forward, which is really great. Now I know that there's. What are some of the things that you looked at that were kind of unique and unusual that you found in your research?
Well, you know, Ossining, of course, Ossining had its own chapter of suffrage chapter. Every community had its group of women who were fighting for the vote. And there was actually a march in 1913 up the Albany Post Road from New York City to Albany that went straight through Ossining. And the woman who was in charge of the Ossining suffrage movement was named Elizabeth Underhill. And yes, Underhill Street in Ossining is named for her family, and she never married, but she had a sash that said "Votes for Women," and in fact, I believe that you wore that same sash.
I did. I've worn it on 2 occasions. I showed a movie about the whole issue of women's rights, and Bill Reynolds had that sash that I wore, and then you had given a great presentation, and I put it on again. Feel very good about wearing a sash that came from somebody long ago that was there to get our rights so that we
And that
could
is in the
vote.
collection of Bill Reynolds, who's a local presidential historian and
Right.
knows more about all that than anybody. So he's very proud of it.
Right. Dana, thank you so much. It's just a fascinating topic to learn about her story, history, and look forward to all of your other discussions on different topics. And if somebody wants to invite you to come in and talk about these issues, I am sure that you are available to do that.
I am Dana White at optonline.net.
Okay. Thanks, Dana, very much. And thank you all for watching. If you have any questions that have come up, just don't hesitate giving me a call at 914-941-1111. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good evening. Thanks.